Hello. Thank you for joining me on this virtual program about the first Virginians, Native Americans in Northern Virginia. My name is Bill Backus. I am the preservationist for the Prince William County Historic Preservation Division, part of the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. The Historic Preservation Division is tasked with managing all county-owned historic sites, and those range from colonial sites in the eastern end of the county, such as Ripon Lodge in Woodbridge or Williams Ordinary in Dumfries, to Civil War sites like at Ben Lomond Historic Site in Manassas or Bristow Station Battlefield in Bristow. They also range from historic sites in Montclair, such as the Barnes House, to Bushy Park in the Gainesville Haymarket area, to the Brentsville Courthouse Historic Center in Bristow. But again, right now, we're going to be exploring the history of Native Americans in our area. And this presentation will just be hopefully a hair over 30 minutes. This is a topic that ranges literally thousands of years. And so this is intended mainly to be an introductory course to get people primed on Native American history in our area. At the end of this presentation, there are some sources that you can check out from your local library and read more about this topic. Also, I have included some more in-depth books on Native American history in Northern Virginia. And I've also included my contact information. So if you have any questions, you can contact me as well. We're going to start actually with this individual real quick. His name is John Smith. He is one of the more well-known English settlers of the Jamestown colony established in 1607. But for our purposes, a year later in 1608, he actually explores the Chesapeake Bay area, including the Potomac River area. And at the end of this exploration, one of the things that he creates is a map. And this map not only shows some of the geographical areas of our region, but also for our purposes today, really shows how the area is settled by different Native American groups. Not only does this map show the settlement on the rivers themselves, so these are the tribes that John Smith and his compatriots are actually physically meeting themselves, but there is information being passed to the English, allowing John Smith to make observations about the hinterland of both Maryland and Virginia, areas that he did not physically visit himself. So again, it allows us in 2021 to have a better sense of how this area looked like over 400 years ago. But we have to keep in mind, however, that the information is all processed through John Smith. And so we have to keep in mind that he is an elite colonial explorer. And so some of this information will be colored through his life experiences. Now, this is the map that he creates at the end of this exploration. And you can see there are some errors, especially for us well-versed today. The two main errors are basically the Virginia Sea, which is the Atlantic, but you can see the Delmarva Peninsula is way too big in this particular map, and the Chesapeake Bay is way too small. The bay in this particular map looks like a river rather than the large bay that we know it today. This is an insert of that map of our region. So this river that you see snaking from the left up towards the center of your screen and back down to the right, that's the Potomac River. Where that large letter N is, that is the Northern Virginia area today. So this is Fairfax, Prince William, Stafford, and Fauquier counties. You can see Burton's Mount, that's basically the Bull Run Mountains, and where the Native American village, the Tunuxet, mainly also known as the Doe Egg or the Dog Tribe, that is Mason's Neck in Fairfax County. So you can see there are Native settlements, Native groups, Native tribes on both sides of the Potomac River. But what's interesting is on this particular map, that there are more Native American settlements on the Maryland side of the Potomac River rather than on the Virginia side. But this is a map of 1608. As I mentioned at the beginning, Native American history in this area goes back thousands of years, and a very brief introduction of how the northern and southern American continents are initially settled. Back way back during the Ice Age, when the sea levels are at different levels, there's actually a land bridge connecting North America to the Eurasian continent. And so people are able to cross this, by this point, non-existent sea into what is now modern day Alaska. You can see on the map on your left, there are glaciers that initially prevent people from exploring or settling further to the south, but eventually there are paths that are going to open up in the glaciers, allowing people to explore further south into North America. On the map on your right shows this larger transfer of people going from east and west, but also I wanted to show on this map that there is the representation of a new debate going on, mainly in the past 20 or 30 years, about potentially the Southern American continent being actually settled not by people coming from the Bering Sea land bridge, but rather coming directly over the the Pacific Sea. And so you can see in this map, we're talking about 40 to 30,000 years ago. These time periods are tens of thousands of years in the past. And so one of the ways that we know about people from this time period is through this, and this is archaeology. And archaeology is the study of objects that people leave behind in the ground. And so by looking at where the items are found and also what items are left, we have the ability to try and answer some of these big historical questions that we have of this time period, ranging from tens of thousands of years ago. Now, for the Paleo-Indian time period, so this is from about 14,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago, the main objects that are left behind are projectile points. They're not arrowheads. That's the more common term that we have for them today, but these are actually referred to as projectile points, and we'll have a better representation of why we call them projectile points in a little bit. But you can see the evolution of how they look and how they change over the years allows historians and archaeologists today to date certain sites that we find these projectile points at. And some of the oldest sites that we found in Virginia relate to what's at the bottom of this slide called the Clovis time period. So again, about 12 to 13,000 years ago. And one potential pre-Clovis site is in the Cactus Hill area in southeastern Virginia, near the Virginia Beach area today. And that again would be ranging about 13,000 years ago. Now, I mentioned a few moments earlier that finding these objects are important, but also where they're found is also very important. And so this is just a limited data sample of Paleo-Indian artifacts found in North America. So this is not by any stretch an exhaustive list of where these artifacts are being found, but you can see that the distribution shows some pretty interesting things. You can see with no objects being found in what is now modern day Canada, that there are large glaciers still existing in this part of the North American continent when people are exploring and settling the North American continent thousands of years ago. And you also can see that the geography of North America plays a pretty strong role in how people are settling this area. You can see in the Virginia area. So if you go down and see the Virginia area right here, you can see that the Appalachian Mountains pose a pretty strong physical barrier. So there's not a lot of those artifacts found in the Appalachian area of Western Virginia today and West Virginia. What's interesting is other mountainous areas like the Rockies really isn't proving to be as problematic for settlement and exploration as the Appalachian Mountains show on this particular map. Now, I mentioned earlier that we refer to most of the artifacts that we find as projectile points, not as arrowheads, because most of the projectile points are being used on an object like this. A spear with a spear thrower, commonly called an atlatl. And atlatls are used throughout the Paleo-Indian time period all the way to the Archaic period, ranging from about 8,000 BCE or before Common Era to the late Archaic, all the way up to 1,000 years of BCE. So you can see again why we refer to projectile points and not as arrowheads. After the Archaic time period, what most people are familiar with Native American history today is the Woodland period. And the Woodland period basically ranges from 1000 BCE to basically European contact at 1500 CE. And so this is when you have the traditional Native American tribes that we associate today in 2021 being established. And this is a representation of an Eastern Algonquian tribe in the North Carolinian Virginian area by an English explorer in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And one of the really core aspects of this representation is it's a good showing of how the diet really starts to change settlement patterns. Before the Woodland period, most people in the North American continent are hunter-gatherers. They follow wildlife game. But by the Woodland time period, hunting and fishing is still very important. But agriculture is becoming increasingly important. And agriculture actually allows for larger population sizes and also the complexity of Native American societies to be established. And so what you would see if we were able to go back about 400 or 500 years ago, right at the cusp of European contact, would be a site like this. This is a rendition of Crab Orchard, which is a Native American settlement that was explored by archaeologists. It's located in Tazewell County in Southwest Virginia. But this is a good representation of what a Native American settlement would look like in Virginia right at the beginning of European contact. You can see structures being built, homes, and other multi-purpose structures being built, and also more importantly, stockades being established, wooden walls being established for defense. So you have semi-permanent settlements being created during this time period, but you also have extensive trade going on with many different groups. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a map that shows the Virginia area in the Eastern Atlantic seaboard, but this map, I think, gives a good representation of the trade routes that are being established in the years before European contact takes place. We know these trade routes because we're finding geological objects that are found in only very certain parts of the North American continent in places that they are not normally found. So you can find like copper or other types of stone being found hundreds or thousands of miles away from where they're naturally occurring. The only way that they can travel is through by people. And so there are pretty extensive trade groups that are being established in the years before European contact. And so this allows information to travel, but unfortunately also for disease to travel. Now, this is an image of smallpox taken in 1973, shortly before it was eradicated. It's not 100% eradicated, but generally scientists argue that smallpox is eradicated as a worldwide disease today. That has not always been the case. Smallpox has been historically a very dangerous and deadly disease, especially to the peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Being isolated from the Euro-Asian continent after the Bering Land Bridge evaporates with rising sea levels, smallpox is not introduced to the North American and South American continents until the Europeans arrive. And so unlike Europeans who have a little bit of an immunity to smallpox, Native American groups have almost no immunity to smallpox. And so when disease reaches groups, it can go through tribes and more complex societies like wildfire. And so disease being carried by people on these trade groups, these trade routes, can decimate Native American populations years, decades, sometimes even centuries before the first European physically arrived to a particular place. For example, there has been some recent estimates from 2018 thinking that between 1492, with the first permanent European contact in the Caribbean era, to 1600, basically with the establishment of Jamestown, within that about 100-year period, 56 million people in the Americas die of disease. These trade routes bring disease, but they also, again, bring information. And so the official settlement of Virginia is in 1607 by English settlers, but there's Native Americans living in Virginia for thousands of years beforehand. But even before Jamestown is established, most of the Native Americans living in what is now Virginia would know of Europeans. Even if they have not physically seen them themselves, from information traveling along the trade networks, they would know about the Europeans' settlements in the Caribbean area and also the Central American area. And also actually in the 1500s, there are periodic French, Spanish, and English explorations of the Virginia area. The more well-known event takes place in the 1500s when a Virginian Native American encounters a Spanish ship that has been blown off course, going up, and it gets diverted to the Chesapeake Bay area, basically up what is now the York River, looking for supplies. The Spanish crew finds supplies, but also finds some Native American groups, and they actually are able to convince a few of these Native peoples to accompany them first to the Caribbean and then later to Europe, where they become really famous celebrities traveling through Spain and Portugal. Eventually, the group will return back to Virginia. They have been converted to Catholicism, or that is what most of the Spanish missionaries believed. And so they actually try to establish a Jesuit missionary in Virginia, but almost immediately the Native Americans that had accompanied the Spanish back to Spain early in 1561, they reject European standards and return to their native groups, and in the process to destroy that Jesuit missionary that is established in Virginia in the 1500s. And so about 50 years before the English officially arrive and establish the settlement at Jamestown, Native peoples in Virginia are well aware of Europeans. And so the main Native American group in Virginia, including in our region in Northern Virginia, is the Powhatan Confederacy, named after the chief Powhatan, who by 1607 has established a loose confederation of allied tribes in the Chesapeake Bay area. English settlers or English explorers at the 1607 to really the 1620 time period, so really the first 20 years of the colony of Virginia's existence, they misrepresent or they mischaracterize the Powhatan Confederacy. They think it more of a traditional European like monarchy or quasi city-state, but instead it's more of a loose confederation. And so Europeans view Powhatan as basically a European-like monarch who has absolute power over all the tribes that are associated within the Powhatan Confederacy, when in fact, the farther you get from Powhatan's capital along the York River, the less his absolute power is able to be exerted, and the more he actually has to cajole or convince Native groups to follow his decisions. And so this is a map of the Powhatan Confederacy when the English start to arrive in the Chesapeake Bay area in the early 1600s. And you can see that there are tribes in southeastern Virginia along the Chesapeake Bay area. You have groups associated with the Powhatan Confederacy in the Delmarva Peninsula, and also all the way up the Potomac area into Northern Virginia. Like I mentioned just a few moments earlier, though, the further you get away from the core of the Confederacy, the less absolute power Powhatan has. And so the tribes on the Delmarva Peninsula and also Northern Virginia are semi-independent from the main core along the James and York rivers. And so occasionally, if the cajoling or the arguments to follow along the decisions from Powhatan fail, Powhatan has in the past raised war bands to physically try to entice tribes to follow his leadership. And so when the English arrive in 1607, again, Native peoples in Virginia already know of Europeans. This is not something that is completely new, but what Powhatan tries to do is try to incorporate the English into this already established system of patronage, of trying to sometimes play off subsets of tribes or other groups off one another. And so initially, Powhatan is going to try and just insert the English into this pre-existing system. But the Powhatans are not the only Native groups in what is now the Commonwealth of Virginia. There are other groups you can see in like southwestern Virginia. The Cherokees are established. And then also in the Piedmont area of Virginia is many diverse groups of people who speak the same language. The Siouan speaking peoples, like the Monahawks and the Monagans. And so in Prince William County in Fairfax, for example, we would be right at basically a borderland between the Powhatan Confederacy and some of these Siouan speaking groups. And one of those borderland tribes would have been the Doe Egg or dog, depending on the spelling. And so they are a traditional Algonquian speaking people. And so they are associated with the Powhatan Confederacy, but because they are so far removed from the core area of the power structure for the Confederacy, they are able to have a semi-independent existence and are able to sometimes play off the Powhatan's political moves with indifference, inaction, and sometimes actually by playing an active role against some of the decisions enacted by the Powhatan leaders. And again, just like the earlier image, you can see the earlier image that I had was from the Cactus Hill area, other large section of Virginia away, but you can see that the native groups, and this, again, this particular image is of a Doe Egg settlement at Mason's Neck, is very similar to a Native American settlement throughout the rest of Virginia, with homes and all their multi-use buildings inside the palisade, and the palisade surrounding the tribe, excuse me, the settlement as protection. And so this is a map of Northern Virginia well into the 20th century. And so I include this map because one of the artifacts of Native American settlement in our region today are place names. And so on this particular map, you can see Mason's Neck is still referred to as Doe Egg Neck, but also most of the streams in the eastern part of the county still retain their original Algonquian names that have been slightly anglicized over the years. So you have the Occoquan, the Chambawamsik, Neabsco, Quantico. These are all names that are derived from the Doe Eggs settling here in the 1600s. There's going to be some changes, though, unfortunately for the Doe Eggs. They're not initially going to be involved in a scene like this. Eventually, there's going to be two Anglo-Powhatan wars that are going to be breaking out between the English settlers in the James River and York area settlements and the core of the Powhatan Confederacy. And so the first Powhatan War takes place between 1610 and 1614. There's ultimately going to be a peace settlement that's reached, but there's going to be a second larger war that breaks out in 1622, lasting for 10 years, finally ending with the Powhatans being politically broken in 1632. The engraving that we have on this slide shows that first day of the Second Powhatan War, in which 300 English and European settlers are killed in one day. That amounts to about a third of English settlers in the Virginia colony at that time. So again, the tribes in Northern Virginia really aren't going to play really any role in this event because there's really no English settlements in this area in the 1620s. What this does unleash, though, is an absolute hatred towards Native Americans by most English settlers, survivors of these wars that then will be passed on to not only subsequent generations, but also to new explorers and to new settlers. And so the English government during this time period was exploring the way of somehow trying to assimilate Native groups into a more peaceful English larger colony. But the effect of the two Powhatan Wars was to create hatred through most English settlers, resulting in mainly a genocidal view on most Native groups in Virginia. This will all culminate a little bit later in the 1670s with this guy, Nathaniel Bacon. By this point, there are more settlements in the Northern Virginia area. There has been some fighting between native groups, especially the Doe Eggs, and some of these some of these English settlers coming up the Potomac River. And this will eventually culminate in what's called Bacon's Rebellion, in which the leader, Nathaniel Bacon, rejects the main English government's authority in Virginia because in his mind, they are not dealing with the Native American presence in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so these two images show two different representations of Nathaniel Bacon. Sometimes he's thought as a precursor to the American Revolution, but he also is involved in a rebellion against the English settlement. He actually burns the English capital at Jamestown. But what this does is this unleashes a genocidal war in Virginia between English settlers and Native American groups. And this culmination at Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion really culminates in the depopulation of Prince William County of Native American groups, especially the Doe Egg tribes, because continued low-intensity warfare has unfortunately played a role in diminishing the number of settlements in Prince William County for Native peoples. And so the outbreak of Bacon's Rebellion with more high-intensity warfare really makes Northern Virginia into a semi-war zone. And so after the end of Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion, most of the Doe Egg Native Americans, they have relocated to King George County in Virginia. Some have relocated and assimilated to other tribes in modern-day Caroline County, while others crossed the Potomac River and went into tribes in Maryland. And so many of the Prince William tribes are going to be incorporated into other Native American tribes outside of Prince William County. So when this happens, when this large land grant is established, known as the Fairfax Land Grant, is established in the 1700s, there really is not a large number of Native Americans living in Prince William County by this point anymore. They have already left this area, and this entices more and more English settlers to come up to Northern Virginia and to establish English settlements. And again, you can see in this particular map, by this point, there are no there's no Native American settlements, there are just English settlements. But again, even though the Native Americans have left, at least some of the names that they have for geographic areas have remained. So Occoquan and Champawamzik still remain here today. So by the dawn of the 1700s, there really are no Native American groups living in Northern Virginia today. And so most of the Native peoples who are living in Prince William County, ranging from the Doe Eggs from the 1600s to those Paleo-Indians who are arriving in Prince William County 10,000 years ago, they are completely gone. And this is a new chapter in Prince William County history, one in which Native Americans are not present. Unlike other counties other counties in Virginia in which there are Native American reservations that are established and actually survive well into the 19th and 20th centuries. In Prince William County, that is not the case. All Native groups that are living in Prince William County move on to other areas and assimilate into other Native American groups. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Native Americans in Prince William County, this list of books up here are available to be checked out at your local library. But if you want to have even more information, if you're really intrigued about this, here are some more sources that you can explore the history of Native Americans in Prince William County in Virginia during this time period. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Hopefully you've enjoyed this presentation, if you learned a little bit more, and will be interested in learning more about our rich history further. Thank you.